The winter mist clung to the treetops like a silent warning, swallowing sound, shape, and direction. By dawn, an entire platoon had slipped into a region the front-line maps called nothing more than a gray zone, a stretch of forest no one fully understood, and few dared to enter. When their radio went dead, and their last known point vanished in the fog, command marked them missing. But deep inside that silent wilderness, one young scout refused to accept that fate. The forest twisted the senses, turning compass readings unreliable and reducing visibility to just a few steps. Every soldier in the platoon carried the weight of disorientation, unsure whether they were closing in on friendly lines or drifting deeper into enemy territory. Hours felt like days. Trails disappeared. Shadows shifted in ways no veteran could explain. Yet through the confusion, a single point man kept searching for anything, any sign that could guide them out. That scout would make a choice his superiors later called reckless, pointless, and even stupid. A signal improvised under extreme pressure, created from scraps and instinct alone. But that signal, unexpected, simple, and nearly dismissed, would cut through the fog, reach the lost platoon, and become the only reason any of them walked out of the dead zone alive. The platoon entered the forest before sunrise, believing they were following a safe woodland path parallel to the main line. Frost coated the leaves, and the air felt unnaturally still. Their orders were routine reconnaissance, nothing more. But as the fog thickened, the landmarks that should have guided them vanished, leaving the men with only muffled footsteps and the cold breath of uncertainty. Minutes later, the trail split into two narrow corridors of trees, and the lead scout moved ahead to clear the way. He expected a short survey, maybe 10 minutes, but the deeper he walked, the more he realized the forest wasn't behaving like any terrain he'd known. Each step faded into a kind of muffled distortion, as if the forest swallowed sound before it could carry back to the platoon. By the time he doubled back, the path behind him had shifted into a maze of identical trees and unfamiliar ground. His calls received no answer. The scout froze, understanding with a jolt that the platoon had drifted, maybe only yards, maybe far more, into an unmarked and unstable dead zone. Behind him, the platoon tried to reorient, but every direction looked the same. They relied on the radio, hoping to reach command, but only static replied. The forest's density, combined with atmospheric interference, rendered the equipment nearly useless. Their only guide became their own instincts, which the dead zone twisted mercilessly. As anxiety grew, so did doubt. The men debated whether they should push forward or fall back. No option felt reliable, and each minute lost made the forest feel heavier. The lieutenant ordered a halt, hoping the scout would return, but even that simple hope started to fade as the fog swallowed more of their senses. Hours passed, and the quiet turned oppressive. The platoon no longer felt like a cohesive unit advancing toward an objective. They were becoming survivors, navigating a shifting void, unsure if rescue was even possible. The scout moved slowly through the frozen undergrowth, marking trees with his knife. But every time he looped back, the marks seemed misplaced, as though the forest rearranged itself when unseen. The feeling wasn't supernatural. It was far more dangerous. The terrain was a labyrinth of intersecting deer paths, mirroring each other so precisely that even experienced trackers could lose their bearings. He paused to check his compass, but the needle spun erratically. Metal deposits beneath the ground, combined with the damp air, corrupted the reading. The scout cursed under his breath, knowing he was now blind in every practical sense. Still, he kept moving, believing that if he stopped, the forest would swallow him the same way it had swallowed the platoon. As he pushed forward, he realized he wasn't alone. Faint footprints, fresh yet directionless, crossed the ground. The platoon was close, drifting like ghosts through the same wooded trap. If he could find a way to stand out in this sensory-suffocating void, he might still lead them back. But the question was, how? Back with the platoon, morale began to crack. The men tried to stay together, but with every slight turn, their formation stretched thinner. Two soldiers swore they saw their scouts' tracks, while another insisted they were circling the same cluster of trees. The fog warped distance, making 20 yards feel like 2 miles. The lieutenant ordered the platoon to conserve energy and remain stationary. But standing still in such a place only worsened the unease. Every shadow felt alive. Every distant creak of branches made their trigger fingers twitch. They knew they needed to move, but without direction, movement felt like surrendering to chaos. Tension escalated when one soldier collapsed, exhausted from the mental strain. The men gathered around him, realizing the forest was not merely confusing them, it was draining them. The dead zone wasn't killing them with bullets, but with disorientation and fear. The scout finally located a vantage point. A fallen tree stretched across a shallow ridge. From there, he could see a faint depression in the landscape, possibly the platoon's position, but shouting would only disorient them further. Firing a shot risked attracting enemy patrols rumored to be active in the area. He checked his gear for anything useful and found only basic rations, a broken mirror, and a torn signal cloth. The cloth was useless in fog. The mirror needed sunlight, which the dense canopy denied. Every option felt impractical. He needed something the men could sense, even without sight. Then he noticed the frost beneath his boots crackling in a faint pattern. The wind was shifting the fog ever so slightly. If he could manipulate that environment, he might create a marker, something unnatural enough to stand out. He gathered branches, bark, and pine resin, shaping an idea so unorthodox that even he doubted it would work. Deep in the dead zone, the platoon huddled near a small clearing. The frost along the ground grew thicker by the hour, and every breath turned into a cloud that hung motionless in the air. The soldiers whispered about whether they'd ever find their bearings again. The forest made even the passing of time uncertain. One private noticed an odd scent drifting through the fog, a smell like burning resin, faint but distinct. The men stiffened, unsure whether it signaled danger or salvation. Nothing in the forest should have produced that aroma naturally, not in such cold and damp conditions. The lieutenant raised his hand and ordered silence. The entire platoon listened, their senses sharpening for the first time since entering the dead zone. Something was cutting through the fog, altering the stillness around them. The scout knelt beside a small fire he'd built inside a hollowed-out trench of wet bark, a fire engineered not for flames, but for heavy, slow-moving smoke. The pine resin thickened the fumes, creating a low plume that hugged the forest floor and crawled through the trees like a living signal. Under normal conditions, it would disperse quickly, but the dead zone's trapped air held it intact. He shaped the smoke by adjusting the trench's angles, creating a steady directional flow. It wasn't a signal flare. It wasn't a torch. It wasn't even visible from long range, but it traveled along the ground, forming an unnatural trail that any soldier would notice. It was, by official standards, a stupid idea. Undisciplined, improvised, and outside protocol. But in a place that defied every rule of navigation, the scout trusted the instinct that had kept him alive more times than training ever had. The platoon watched as the fog near their boots shifted, swirling into darker streaks that drifted toward a single direction. The private who first smelled the resin pointed silently, and the lieutenant crouched to study the movement. This was no natural pattern. It moved with purpose. For the first time since their disorientation began, the men had a reference point, something to follow, something that didn't shift or vanish like the elusive paths around them. The lieutenant signaled for quiet movement, ordering the platoon to stay low and track the darkened fog. With each careful step, the smoke grew denser. The men felt a spark of hope, dangerous but necessary. They tightened their grips on their rifles, alert for any threat along this mysterious trail. The scout maintained the fire, monitoring the flow of smoke. The resin burned slowly, producing just enough material to send a consistent drift across the ground. He prayed the platoon would recognize the unnatural pattern and interpret it as a guide rather than a trap. Minutes stretched as the fire consumed the last of the resin. If the platoon didn't reach him soon, the trail would fade, and he'd be forced to come up with another desperate measure. But his gut told him they were close. Cosquint realized. As he prepared more resin, he heard faint movement, soft, synchronized, military. Relief washed over him, but he stayed cautious. Only when he recognized the rhythmic crunch of familiar boots did he allow himself to breathe deeply. The platoon emerged through the fog like silhouettes stepping out of a dream. When they saw the scout kneeling beside the smoldering trench, a wave of disbelief rippled through the ranks. The lieutenant approached him first, stunned by the simplicity of the method that had guided them out. The scout explained his thinking, expecting reprimand or skepticism. Instead, the lieutenant gripped his shoulder, recognizing that this improvised signal, however unorthodox, had been the only beacon strong enough to cut through the labyrinth around them. The men gathered, warmed their hands near the controlled fire, and prepared to retrace their way back using the same method. With the smoke trail as their guide, the platoon moved in formation, staying close and avoiding the branching paths that had previously separated them. The fog still distorted distances, but the drifting fumes anchored their progress. Each step pulled them further from the dead zone's grip. The scout led with measured confidence, watching the way the smoke reacted to the wind. As long as the trail remained visible, they maintained direction. The lieutenant ordered periodic halts to ensure no one drifted off course. Discipline, not speed, was their lifeline now. Slowly, familiar terrain emerged. Trees with identifiable scars, soil less saturated, frost patterns that matched their original path. They were leaving the zone. When the platoon finally broke through the last layer of fog and stepped into clearer daylight, the forest opened into the recognizable contour lines of their mapped route. The radio crackled back to life moments later, confirming what they already felt. They were safe. Command initially questioned the scout's method, labeling it unapproved and risky. But the lieutenant defended him fiercely, emphasizing that without that stupid signal, 30 men would have disappeared into a region no map could define. Weeks later, the scout's action became an unofficial teaching point, proof that sometimes survival depends not on perfect equipment or flawless tactics, but on instinct, improvisation, and courage under extreme pressure. His signal had saved them, and in the dead zone, that made all the difference.